so I wanted to bring everything back into a scientific sense. So I thought if I'm going to make any statements about storytelling, I'd really like to know what underpins that psychologically and from a neuroscientific point of view as well. So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. And it's going to be a very short presentation. There's not really a lot to it, but hopefully it will generate some good discussion. But essentially, I wanted to go over the power of stories, what I think are the key components of a good story, how stories can inspire action with some really good examples, especially one from my own life as well, which is how a 9-word story saved 11 lives. It's a completely true story. And then we'll open it up for some Q&A at the end. So in terms of the power of stories, one of the things that's great about stories is they're easier to remember than facts. A great example of this is if you think about being given a list of words to remember, and like we write them down, I give you like 1 minute and then see how your recall is. If you just try to remember those words without any kind of strategy, you're not going to do too well. But if I say to you, I want you to write the words down and then I want you to form story in your mind. So let's say the words are, for example, boat, pencil, door, that kind of thing. Then maybe in your mind you'll see a boat and the boat will pull into the dock and you'll see the front of it shaped like a pencil and there's a door. You go in through the door and you build this mental imagery in your head. And for some reason it sticks really well. In fact, the example I just gave you are the first 3 items that were on a list I was given in a test in 1996, and I still remember it to this day. That's probably an example of something called the primacy bias, because it was the first time I was ever asked to do this. But to give you an example of how powerful this is, when I was at Sussex University, they wanted me to do a charity event and raise some money. So what I did is I said, I think I can remember 1,000 objects in order. And it took 8 hours. They put me in a room, locked me in a room for 8 hours. And when I came out of the room, whilst it took me 45 minutes, I could remember those 1,000 objects completely in the correct order. And that's because of the way our brain is hardwired for storytelling. And I'll go into a little bit about how that works and why that's the case, but I hope that gives a really good example of the power that stories can elicit. They can change hearts and minds as well. We'll see an example shortly of if you tell stories the right way and you put the right ingredients in, you actually can open people up to have their minds changed and their hearts changed in ways that maybe if you were to produce a bunch of facts or a bunch of statistics, they wouldn't have the same effect. They also help enforce tribal norms and behaviors. In fact, this is probably where they originated from. The idea is that, there's a tribe, living on the plains hundreds of thousands of years ago, and, you've got a situation where there's an area, there's a lot of saber-toothed tigers. It's easier to tell someone the story about, hey, one of our guys ventured out there and it didn't work out well for him. So you've already got that information in advance. You don't need to actually experience it for yourself. And also because we're such a, a social animal, having these norms and behaviors is important because you know what the correct things are to do to get along in the group and to do well and climb the status ladder. And you also know what the bad things are, that if you do those, you'll be frowned upon and things won't work out for you. So, I mean, we even see this in terms of, animals all the way down to, like meerkats. I remember Meerkat Manor I used to watch in England, and it was very, very similar. Obviously, they didn't have the power of storytelling, but they did have those ingrained, this is what you should do and this is what you shouldn't do behaviors. I will also stress this is one of the reasons why gossip magazines are so popular, because essentially what gossip is, whether we want to admit it or not, is us exchanging our value systems. This is what's appropriate, this is what's not appropriate, this is how somebody climbs the ladder, and this is how somebody takes a spectacular fall. They also foster collaboration and unity within a group as well. And I say they've been used for more than 44,000 years because that's the earliest example I could find of a cave painting that documented a story. There's an example here on the side as well of one I got from Egypt, but we don't know exactly how far cave paintings go back. They might go back a lot further than that. So that's just the number of the first recorded story I could find. But the point essentially is that we've been using stories for a very, very long time as a social animal. So I believe that there are some key good components to a good story. So the first thing that you need is what I call an identifiable character. This is a single character that you relate to in some way. That character then will lose control in some manner. They will then experience some conflict, where the outcome is uncertain, and they may learn a lesson. Now, I say this is optional because in the business world, you don't necessarily always want to end the story. Sometimes what you might want to do is create the story and allow the audience to create the ending themselves. But if you do tell a story, and you can use this like I said, for a 9-word Facebook post, or you could use this for a 90-minute feature film. The principles still hold true. And these slides will be sent out after the presentation. So don't worry if you need to scramble to take notes or anything like that. All of this information will be ready for you. So let's go through. So first of all, an identifiable character. So this rather gruesome image that you're seeing right now is a turtle that allegedly got a plastic straw stuck in its nose, and it caused a lot of outrage when people found it, and this was in 2019. And this relates to a story that an author named Nate Andolsky told in his book, Decoding the Why. And he basically said that they had a plastic straw ban in Seattle, and I think they enacted it around 2014, and nothing really happened. There wasn't really sort of much passion around the project until this incident. And then suddenly this one little turtle, despite the fact that this was happening on a much broader scale, sort of blew everything up in the media, and suddenly there was a lot more traction with that ban. And this goes through, this is because of something called psychic numbing. And what this really means is if you have one individual, one story, people can relate directly to that and take a lot away from it. Whereas if you were to say 50,000 turtles are blah, blah, blah every year, the number isn't really relatable because of the way our brains work. We're much more related to other individuals. In fact, there's this really fascinating phenomena where they discovered something that they call, when they were looking at mirror neurons, they discovered something called what they call the Gandhi neuron. And essentially what that is if you were to place a person opposite you and maybe stroke their arm, the only thing that's stopping you from feeling that sensation is actually your skin, because it's giving you feedback to your body to tell you that nothing's actually happening. But if you removed the senses in your skin, you would actually feel that as well. It's incredible. It's amazing how we've evolved to be able to have these ability to mirror other people and other creatures. And so I think that plays a lot into why that's so powerful. But essentially, there's some really good quotes here. If I look at the many, I will never act, but if I look at the one, I will, which is by Mother Teresa, which exemplifies this point. The next quote is a bit debatable as to who actually said it. It's sometimes attributed to Stalin, but essentially a single death is a tragedy, but millions of deaths is a statistic. So again, this is why it's very important to focus on one identifiable character. Now, I will say it's not a hard and fast rule. You could have more than one. You could have two, and I've got a great example I'm going to show you later on, which is two people. But essentially, the studies show that the more people you add in, the lower the effect. And this is what we call the identifiable victim effect. Basically, if we care about someone, then our bodies will release oxytocin. It's a pro-social neurochemical, and essentially it's one of the biggest foundations of compassion. So then what happens is we have our identifiable character, and then they lose control. So this is where we get to say that, the world gets completely turned upside down, and we are not in Kansas anymore. And all humans have a set of core beliefs about how the world functions. They're basically a series of cause and effect rules that are in our mind. We're not really that aware of them. It happens kind of below the surface. But there's a really interesting book called The Science of Storytelling, and that book talks about something called the theory of control. So essentially all animals and all humans have this theory of control. And essentially really what this means is it's what you think will happen if you act in certain ways. So I know if I consistently show up late or I verbally abuse my boss, it's not going to end well. If I show up early and I put lots of effort in and I collaborate with my team members, it's more likely to help me up the promotion ladder if that's what I'm interested in. And so essentially, and this goes all the way down to the biological underpinnings of animals can't essentially know if this is what I do, it's going to work out well. And so they have an idea of things that they should do and things that they shouldn't. And this is why stories fascinate us so much and why they grip us, because essentially they're teaching us. They're teaching us about, causes and effects. And we're very, very interested, especially if it's something we've never seen before, because we want to understand how to handle that situation. And then the moment of change, which if you're looking at this from a screenwriting point of view, this is what would be considered the second act. So this is the moment where the story really starts. The first act in a screenplay is just getting to know the character, getting to see how the theory of control is working quite nicely. Then you throw in this huge curveball and everything changes, and that becomes the second act. And so that this moment of change is so important because our minds are hardwired for change. If you go through your life and everything is completely predictable, you will forget it. And actually, that's kind of one of the saddest things about life is I remember when I have 3 rescue dogs, and I distinctly remember when I got them, and I remember the first few days when I had them. But most days just disappear, and I have no recollection of them, and it's very sad. And it's because most days are entirely predictable. So that's why change is so important. Contrast is so important because it grips your attention. And that releases cortisol, and like I said, that focuses attention, which is what we want as a storyteller. Now, in order to amplify the feeling of losing control, you can use a sense of unfairness. This will trigger inequity aversion, but a sense of unfairness is like beginning the second act but doing it on steroids. So then we go into the section where the character experiences conflict. What you're seeing here are increases and decreases in emotional intensity. This was mapped out by the authors of a book called The Bestseller Code, and they looked at the success of the Da Vinci Code and 50 Shades of Grey, and they follow a very similar pattern. Now, if you are making, let's say, a 30-second video, obviously you're not going to have an opportunity to do this, but you still want to have conflict. And all that essentially is well, you have your moment of change, and then your character tries to react to that moment of change and do something, but he's butting heads with the environment. The environment is pushing back. So that's what the conflict essentially is. So the character immediately tries to regain control. They encounter, like I said, if it's a longer text, then they will encounter a symphony of changes they're constantly reacting to. You have these peaks and valleys because if it was constantly intense, what would happen is people would just be exhausted. Also, people would lose, they'd start to lose attention as well, because that's why we say we pay attention. It's a limited commodity. If you guys have seen the film Saving Private Ryan, you will understand what I mean by this. Saving Private Ryan has these peaks and troughs very nicely, but the final peak is just too long. It's a battle scene and it goes on for about 40 minutes, and a lot of people start to zone out here and there in it. And it's because it doesn't have that nice crisp elevation and then decreation in emotion. The character, just bear with me here, I've got my thing in the way. The character must experience emotion. This is very important because if the character doesn't experience any kind of emotion, then we can't empathize with the character. And as the character learns new things to help them, they re-establish their theory of controls, and therefore our bodies release dopamine. And that's because when they try to regain control and things work, they're learning. And as they learn, we learn. And there are common neural responses to feeling pain and seeing pain in others. I kind of mentioned these already with the mirror neurons and the Gandhi neurons. But essentially, if you see a character going through something and it's unfair or it's painful, you'll start to feel the same things as well. That's what makes the storytelling so compelling. So to amplify this, hook into a deeper human truth. So if the story is fundamentally about death or family, human connection, those kind of things, it's more likely to make more of an impression, especially when the emotional moments heighten. And so the next step is the outcome is uncertain. So we create information gaps, and that will create gnawing levels of curiosity. A good trick, also, I've seen this in TV series as well, especially J.J. Abrams, is to have a mystery, and then people will want to understand the solution to the mystery. People will tend to fill in information gaps themselves, and the human brain has an irresistible inborn drive to build scenarios. The uncertain outcome of a conflict situation triggers this propensity. So if you've ever seen a film where you were so invested in it, you were trying to come up with ways that you would solve the problem, this is a great example. The best example I've seen of this is a film called Phone Booth with Colin Farrell. And in that film, he's trapped in a phone booth. He's got a gunman who's a trained sniper So he can't leave the phone booth, and he's trying to come up with all these different ways. And I found that a lot of people that watch that film, they immediately start generating these scenarios as well. But this is how you get people to insert themselves into the story and become part of it, is you create these little gaps. And then, because if you just tell everybody everything, it's not going to be that interesting. But if you imply certain things, but you make people come up with their, oh, well, okay, I think I see how that works, and they start creating their own theories of control, then they'll want to know if they hold true. So they'll insert themselves, but then you'll still have their attention because they'll want to see how things play out. And so a really great way to amplify this is to add a ticking clock. This is something that in screenwriting theory we normally place at what we call the midpoint of the story. And a ticking clock starts, and then that's it. You know, that essentially the reason that works is because it pushes characters forwards. If there's no ticking clock, there's no incentive to push the characters into the uncertain. And of course, most living creatures don't want to go towards anything that's uncertain. So this is a great way of pushing them forwards. So the next thing is learn a lesson. So like I said, this is optional. So, of course, Dorothy learns a great lesson at the end of her story, There's No Place Like Home. Our beliefs, attitudes, and intentions are vulnerable to change during something called narrative transportation. Narrative transportation is where you literally put someone in a story. I'll give you a great example. This film I wrote called Treehouse. I sent it to the casting director that casted Winter's Bone, and she wrote me an email back, and she said she went into a busy cafeteria on a Saturday morning. She put the screenplay in front of her. She started reading it, and she said by the time she finished the final page, she looked up and the entire place was deserted. And she didn't even know that had happened because she was so engrossed in the story. And so this is an example of a very successful narrative transportation. And the reason narrative transportations are so powerful is that once you get people in that world and in the story, they are very, very vulnerable to have their minds changed. Also, just a note on endings as well. This is quite funny. Brain scans reveal the mere anticipation of a selfish person being punished is experienced as pleasurable. And again, this kind of goes into the fact that we're social animals, and so we want to see the bad guy lose. We want to see them get their comeuppance because it reinforces all of our social rules that we've developed over so many thousands of years. A good trick, and this isn't just for stories, this is for anything, products, you name it, is they should feel familiar but novel. And that's because human beings essentially have two drives that are in conflict with one another that we're constantly balancing. So one is exploitation. So we want to exploit the environment. We want to gather food. We want to stay healthy. We want to create a state of homeostasis, as they say. But then if you just stay, imagine if you're an animal and you just stay in the same place and all the resources dry up, you'll be dead. So this is why novelty is so important. This is why exploration is an important drive. And so people have found that if you mix the familiar with the novel, then essentially it's comfortable because it's predictable. But then when we see novelty, in fact, when we anticipate novelty, our brain sees it as good as a reward in the environment that we know exists for certain. And so one way to amplify this is with surprise. So surprise will amplify either a happy or tragic story. I was going to play it today, but for time purposes, I'm not. Go look up Google's ad if you haven't seen it, called Parisian Love. But that has a very, very surprising and beautiful ending. And a lot of people find that very emotional to watch. And the rule of thumb essentially is we all have a number of basic emotions. But if you add surprise to any of those emotions, it pushes it up, it boosts it up. So how stories can inspire action. So basically, let me shift this over again. So basically, both oxytocin and cortisol need to be present to maximize impact. And that's because you need trust and attention. If you've got both of those, then studies have shown that charity donations have increased by 261% after showing a very moving film. So the cortisol grabs the attention, but then the oxytocin is the trust. It's the bond that you have with your main character. The call to action then gives the audience a way to control how the story ends, which is why I said you may not always want to end the story. You may want your audience to end the story for you. They can impose their own theory of control to bring about a fulfilling end. And the purposes of the negative stakes that we've seen all the way through the story can then be contrasted with the happy ending. Stories that paint essence can change perceptions and values. And what I mean by essence is that think about your original wedding ring and then imagine someone clone that. Would that be as valuable as the original wedding ring? It wouldn't. And it's because you've attached certain things to that object, and that's what stories can do. I can't remember the name of the project, but I'm sure Jez will be able to remind us. There was a famous project done where they sold a number of items on eBay. They bought them for between $1 and $3, but then when they sold them, they added a story to them. Very intricate story with lots of embellishments, and of course they made a lot of money from doing that because the story added to the value by creating essence. Another very important point about stories is that we are the stories that we tell ourselves. This is very important if you ever know anybody that's going through a tough time. It doesn't even necessarily have to relate to that. You could even relate to a CEO that's struggling in their business. Is when people start telling themselves stories, that becomes their theory of control. And of course, the behavior then follows the stories. So if you can change those stories, then you can change the behavior. And the most powerful stories revolve around selfless heroes, overcoming the odds, and also companionship and love. So here's two really great examples. So neither of these are, intricate long stories. I mean, they're both just simple posts, both of which I found on Facebook. The first one is an example I wanted to use because it's two characters rather than one, just to show that you can do that. And I really like this. This man posted, my son and his best friend both told their survival rate would be under 2%. They'd never walk and they'd live in a vegetative state if they made it past 7 years old. Both walked the stage and graduated tonight. And so you can see it has all of the key elements that I believe are important for a storyteller. You have the identifiable characters. What's happened to them is very, very unfair. You don't even need to see the trials and tribulations because your mind can fill in those gaps. You can understand what they must have been through in their lives. You can imagine how uncertain their life must have been. And the same holds true for the dog as well. And the funny thing about this story is, I have no idea if it's even true. That's the great thing about stories. You just don't know. But the key is, do they work or not? And this story absolutely worked about the pit bull that was so committed to its friendship that it was selfless and actually put itself at risk of wanting to stay in the shelter to save its friend. And selfless heroes are another big part of our culture. So I wanted to show you a quick video now. I think this video, if it loads, will give a really great example of all of the key elements that I've mentioned. This is a small advert that was shown in England many, many years ago when I lived there, I think in the early 2000s. But look out for all the key elements that I mentioned. So I think what makes that work so well is there's obviously a very identifiable character. We see a family man with his family. Obviously, he loves them. He's a good person. He's worked hard for them. We then see that when he goes for this drive in the car, he loses control at a moment, and it's an unexpected change. You can see that by the reaction on his face when he obviously sees something that's oncoming. Now, the conflict is very brief in this, but essentially it's where he tries to turn the steering wheel and he can't actually make a change, but he's trying. And at that moment, you can imagine the emotion that he's feeling. What also makes this so powerful is that you see his family and you see their emotional reactions as well. And of course, there's an uncertain outcome. You don't know what's going to happen, but he does learn a very valuable lesson. And of course, the lesson is, the point is there, is to teach everybody else. And many people that have seen that advert have said it's been much more powerful than if they were just to show a crash that's very, you know, gruesome with some kind of like public service announcement at the end. So this is a really good example of powerful storytelling, and that one was done in, you know, a minute and a half. So now I want to show you a 9-word story that saved 11 lives. This really happened. The only thing I will say is the dog in the picture, this isn't the dog. This is just something that I found off the internet, because I don't have the picture of the original dog. But what happened was, I was scrolling through Facebook one day, and this popped up on the screen. It was a post on Facebook from a dog rescue, and the post said she cried on her way to the youth room. And it was a picture of a dog. Someone was out of frame, and they were pulling on the leash, and the dog was, you know, trying to resist, and the dog looked terrified. And I saw that post, and it just captivated me, and I couldn't say no. I picked up the phone immediately. This place was in South Texas, in Corpus Christi. It's a 12-hour drive away. Now think about all of the dogs and all of the shelters between here and Corpus Christi that need saving. But this one stood out so much because of the story. And the reason it was so powerful was because there was a sweet dog. It was an identifiable character. She was dumped by her owner, which was no fault of her own. It was completely unfair. She was put in a situation that was so terrifying. In fact, you could see that terror, and you could experience that terror as the person looking at the post, that you can understand the conflict that she went through. And of course, it was uncertain. We had a ticking clock. You know, it was uncertain. We didn't know what was going to happen. And that captured me so much that it ended up resulting in the saving of these 11 dogs' lives. And what happened was I got in touch with the woman. That dog had been saved. In fact, you know, again, I question whether that dog even existed. It was a brilliant ploy to get me in. And once I'd made that connection with them, there were a lot of real dogs. The 4 white pit bulls on the left of the screen were a family that were all dumped at the same time. And these rural shelters have a limit. You go over that limit, and unfortunately, it doesn't end well. So I got most of that family out. Some other rescues took 2 of them, but I took most of that family, and I took a whole bunch of these other dogs, and we got them safely to the Humane Society of Southwest Missouri. But anyway, I wanted to show you that because that's a real story. I won't tell you how much it cost me because it's painful, but it was worth every penny. Let's just say that, because they all lived and they were all wonderful, wonderful dogs. That one in the middle on the bottom wasn't even one of the original dogs. He was running in traffic while our transport was driving from Corpus Christi to Missouri. So I told them to stop in Dallas and grab him, and they were able to do that. They were able to get him vetted and get his health certificates. Now, I've got some references. I don't need to talk through these. These are just if you get the slides afterwards and you want to look up some of the stuff I've talked about. But essentially, that covers everything I wanted to talk about today. So if you guys have any questions and answers, I'd be happy to answer them.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Michael. And I think if people can write their questions in the chat, might be good, because that often sort of gets over. I think we were talking to Johanna, mentioned this morning that sometimes it's quite hard for people to talk on top of each other. So you've got some questions sort of on the chat, and as the chat start to load up, I've got sort of one question to you, Michael. You know, I often get accused, I think, of contradicting sort of myself. And often I think the brain does contradict itself. It depends on the context, and it depends on I suppose, yeah, the domain in which you're operating in. But it felt like, you know, in storytelling, you said 2 things. So one was kind of like ambiguity, which we often talk about ambiguity as a negative force, that people don't like ambiguous odds, people don't like to take risks and then move away. And then that sort of conflicts, I think, with this power of uncertainty and anticipation about not knowing. And you know, so it's kind of like, it's a fine line maybe in a customer experience to kind of create anticipation of something, so you're getting people excited about the experience, but not making it so ambiguous and uncertain that they move away. And I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts or advice, or you know, any stories around getting that calibration right. You know, you mentioned Saving Private Ryan, you know, that they obviously got that ending maybe not as good as they could. But yeah, just sort of thinking about, you know, how much anticipation is required, and how much ambiguity and uncertainty is required to get that I suppose ideal experience.
Yeah, sometimes the anticipation of the event can be more powerful than the event itself in terms of what you remember. So getting the anticipation is right. It depends on your business as well. So if you're just a regular restaurant, you're not like some 5-star, of course, that's when you probably want to look into anticipation. If you're a regular restaurant, the patients are going to have their own anticipations already
Yeah.
just based on their experience. But what you can do in this example comes from a book written by Mika Solomon, who's a customer service guy.
Mm-hmm.
He said there's this thing called hedonic adaptation. And what that means is you go through the same experience so many times, and it's beautifully consistent. The problem is that it then stops being interesting.
Yeah.
It becomes almost forgettable. Every time you're in the restaurant, let's say you've gone 12 times this year, you don't really have any unique memories. It's all just the same memory. Unless something crazy happens, like someone drops the wine or something, of course you'll remember that because it's different. So what Mika recommends is you need to sprinkle in a little bit of novelty into the experiences that you design, and you just need to do it every so often so that it keeps it fresh and it stops it from being stale.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one of the key takeaways is to, yes, certainty is good, but too much of it long term and it's just going to make something stale.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good answer. I think, so start with the principle of consistency and, going with the grain of what people know, and then make them feel comfortable. But then, create these moments of delight, which essentially go, oh, actually there is something different.